Matt, I do want to take a hard left turn now because earlier this month, in Midtown Manhattan, the UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson was shot in cold blood. And since his murder, there's really been this almost celebration of the suspected killer, Luigi Mangione, on social media. And this people taking delight in this killing has really moved from the fringes and the dark shadows of the internet to almost mainstream, almost jokes and memes all over the internet. So Emerson College polling asked about this killing. What do people think about the situation?
Right. So this did make quite a few headlines. Obviously, the killing itself, but then also the results of this poll. And so I do want to talk about this. So, we tested the extent to which folks find the killing acceptable or unacceptable. And 68% of voters say that the killing was either somewhat or completely unacceptable. Just 17% say that it was acceptable in some form, and then 16% were sort of unsure or neutral. We saw a strong correlation with age here. So just 10% of voters age 70 plus say that the killing was either somewhat or completely acceptable. And then we see that dropping down in a few age brackets, we see that 23% of those aged 30 to 39 found it acceptable in some form. Then looking at that youngest demographic, where I think a lot of folks have focused, they are split. They say that 40% of them say that the killing was unacceptable, whereas 41% say that it was acceptable, 19% neutral. So again, I think it's worth emphasizing here. The vast majority say that the killing was unacceptable. There are some who are sort of on the fence or maybe don't want to stake out an opinion on it, but it's a minority among voters overall who say that the killing was acceptable.
And can you break it down by party lines? Is there one type of voter, a Democrat or Republican, who would lean more into saying this is more acceptable than maybe another type of voter?
There is a slight party split here. 22% of Democrats say that it was acceptable. But again, the vast majority, 59%, say that the killing was unacceptable, either somewhat or completely. And then when you look at Republicans, they're 12% say that it was acceptable. And then with independents, 16%, again, majority saying that it was unacceptable. So it's much less of a split than it is with some of those younger voters, but we do see a little bit of a partisan divide there.
Matt, this is a really shocking conversation because I do live in Manhattan, where that hotel was where Brian Thompson was killed, is right in Midtown Manhattan, and especially during the holiday season. I mean, it's packed usually. I know this was earlier in the morning, but have you ever polled a question where a murder, what people found it acceptable or not? Because the conversation right away after this murder wasn't one of mourning a loss or shock. It was more so of celebrating what people called almost a Robin Hood vigilante move, which clearly it was a murder.
Yeah, and I think the majority of folks agree with you. We haven't polled anything like this before necessarily. It's a little bit unprecedented. We did take a look earlier this year at some of the effects of the assassination attempts on President Trump. But again, we didn't test it in this sort of form. We saw those conversations online. We did want to test it in such a way that we could gauge, how, how are these conversations that folks are seeing online? Is that really what folks are thinking in real life? And by and large, we found that that's not the case. You know, a lot of these online conversations that are either glorifying or excusing the actions of the killer, that's not necessarily reflecting reality. We see that in those top line numbers. We especially see it among basically anyone over the age of 30. It's really just that 18 to 29 demographic where we see a split. Again, opinion is split there, and take that what you will. But I would not necessarily see that as indicative of any wider movement or that there's approval across the country. That is just not the case.